all my precious relations. I'm Auntie Dr. Anita Sanchez, Nawa, Aztec, Toltec, and learning more about another part of me that I have no stories from the Amazon. I'm so excited today because I have an Indigenous leader, elder, researcher, amazing human being who I first met just a month or two ago. And I was so entranced, just in there when he was talking about his work. So you're going to have a wonderful time listening because I know that you've come here to learn about Indigenous wisdom, about Indigenous knowledge, about all the diversity that we are in and part of. So let me first just go ahead. So welcome, Michael. Welcome to you.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yes. And so now I'm going to just go ahead and introduce you. Michael YellowBird, CMT, MSW, PhD, is Dean and Professor of the Faculty of Social Work, University of Manitoba. Dr. YellowBird is a member of the International Mindfulness Teachers Association and is a certified mindfulness teacher professional and has been practicing mindfulness meditation and Indigenous contemplative practices for more than 47 years. He is a member of the MHA Nation, and I hope I don't destroy this, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara in North Dakota. He has held faculty appointments at the University of British Columbia, Kansas, Arizona State, California Poly, Humboldt, and North Dakota State University. His research focuses on the effects of colonization and methods of decolonization, healthy Indigenous aging, Indigenous mindfulness, and neurodecolonization, Arikara ethnobotany and traditional agriculture, and the cultural significance of res dogs. He is author of numerous scholarly articles and 4 books for Indigenous Eyes Only, the Decolonization Handbook, for Indigenous Minds Only, a Decolonization Handbook in 2012, Indigenous Social Work Around the World, Towards Culturally Relevant Education and Practice in 2008, and Decolonizing Social Work. He is the author of 2 recent books, Asanish, which is Arikara, Ethnobotany, and Decolonizing Holistic Pathways Towards an Integrative Healing in Social Work. I also want to let you know, and this will all be in the website, so you'll be able to see and make sure you take a look at his books. He is currently co-authoring 2 books, Akira Corn and Traditional Agriculture and Decolonizing the Social Work Curriculum, and Memoirs of a Mindful Res Dog and Res Dog Meditations. His most recent scholarly health articles, I don't know where you find all this time, Michael, and be a dean and be the human being that you are, but I love it. The cultural determinants of healthy Indigenous aging, molecular decolonization, and Indigenous microcosm perspective of planetary health. That was in 2020, and decolonizing fasting to improve Indigenous wellness. So there's so much for us to learn from you in this time. And so I want to make sure we have spaciousness. And at this, so what that means is I'll try to ask a few questions because I know that everyone wants to hear what you have to say. And we always start with a centering. And I asked Dr. YellowBird if he'd be willing to do that for us today, and he agreed. So with that, Michael YellowBird, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anita. I'm really glad to be here today and to kind of share and to just provide some information and that I think is helpful to folks. It's been helpful to me. But before we get into that, as Anita said, we'll do a little centering exercise. And so a lot of this is based upon some of the work that I do around Indigenous mindfulness and neurodecolonization, which is, of course, decolonizing the mind, using mindfulness practices and contemplative Indigenous approaches. So I'm just going to ask folks just to kind of sit back, nice and relaxed in their chair or wherever they're sitting. And if you feel safe and okay, just to gently close your eyes and just begin to maybe for the first time today or evening or wherever you're at, begin to feel your body. Begin to feel, the different points of your body touching earth, touching your chair, touching the floor, the ground. And just see yourself at this time in this space, this sacred protected space, this bubble that you're in, where there's safety, where there's knowledge, where there's wisdom and healing. And just allowing yourself to open up as you would when you're feeling very safe and secure. Or just notice all the different parts of your body as you bring a sense of relaxation and a feeling of wellness to each part. Starting with your feet. And if your feet are touching the floor or the earth, notice how they contact with this part of your body, this feeling. Moving your awareness and tension upwards until you feel the rest of your body contact against your chair or wherever you're sitting, or if you're standing. Moving up, again, just awakening and enlivening your body. Energy, sense of emotional wellness, feeling good. And just gently, again, just so gently moving up, giving yourself permission to be gentle with yourself as you move up. Scanning your body upwards, your legs, your feet, your bottoms, your back, your lower abdomen, all moving. You're just your tension, focusing, moving up, back, relaxing as you go along your chest area. And just remembering to breathe as you're doing this, bringing in this flow of life, this breath of life. And then relaxing your hands. Hands do a lot of work for us. Just allow them to have an opportunity just to rest in awareness. They have their own awareness. So we move our attention to our shoulders, to our neck, allowing a sense of relaxation and calm to come over these areas of the body. And then moving our attention to our head, all the way through our face, through our eyes, our sinuses, moving our attention throughout our brain, increasing the connectivity between the different regions of our brain, calming the brain, calming the body at this time. And then just gently shifting your awareness to begin breathing in a nice deep breath, even breath, filling your body, expelling your breath, a nice even breath. And as you're breathing in and breathing out, notice where you're feeling your breath the most. Maybe it's in your belly as you breathe in and your belly rises and falls. Maybe it's in your ribs and chest as you breathe in and they rise on the in-breath, fall on the out-breath. Maybe it's your shoulders that are rising gently with the in-breath, falling gently with the out-breath, just like the waves in the water, lapping up to the shore and then receding, and then lapping up again and then receding. And just notice how this feeling of centering and grounding is all around us and available to us at any time. And again, as you sit in this place of safety in your space that's protected, that is filled with knowledge and wisdom, allow yourself to continue just to feel this sense of relaxation. And now, for a moment, we'll shift our awareness just gently and see ourselves sitting on the land. And as we make our place on the land, we find ourselves centered and spread nice and gently on the land as we sit or we lay on the land, however you visualize yourself being here at this time. And as you breathe in, I encourage you just to feel the place that you're in now, that you're imagining being on the land. Maybe it's in the mountains, maybe it's in the desert, maybe it's on the Great Plains with grasslands, maybe it's near a river, near an ocean, or even in your backyard. That you're having this sense of connectedness to this place and allowing the wisdom of this place to enter into each breath as you breathe in, breathing in, breathing in, breathing in that wisdom, letting it circulate throughout the body. And then as you breathe out, exchanging your connection and your wisdom with this place. So this place begins to know you and you begin to know this place. And again, just a nice, even breath, breathing in, breathing in, breathing in. Hold, and then breathing out, gently breathing out, all the while exchanging breath, this flow of life from this environment around you. The environment gives you life, you give the environment life. This beautiful exchange, this connection that can deepen with more practice, with more connection. Allow that wisdom to saturate your body, that knowledge to be all the way into your bones and into your muscles, to every emotion and feeling. A sense of connectedness and groundedness as you sit here in dignity and awareness, just grounded, closely connected to this place. And as you breathe in this knowledge and this awareness that this is always available to us, we can come back to it whenever we need, again and again and again. But at the same time, we are also giving back to this place with that breath, that sacred exchange of breathing, giving life, exchanging life, being life. Maybe at this time, you have a sense of the ancestors and all the beings that have been in this place, that have moved across this place. And a connection to that movement, a connection to that purpose, connection to that direction. Constantly, consistently breathing in and breathing out with this awareness that we are never truly alone, that are gifted this time and opportunity to acknowledge those that accompany us on this journey, the lands, the waters, the winds, the air, the spirits, the ancestors. And it's the presence and the knowledge of these ancestors, this ancient time that we are still connected to, that we still are a part of, that we still can draw from the knowledge of the land, of the spirits of the land, of all creatures, the four-leggeds, those winged ones that fly, those that crawl, move upon the land, those in the waters, those that we see, and those that we don't see. And now I encourage you just to wrap all of this knowledge and all of this awareness and bring that into your safe space as you sit, this knowledge. Again, remembering that it is available to us at all times. We smile as we breathe in. We smile as we breathe out. Feeling happy as we breathe in. Feeling a sense of wellness as we breathe out. Then a deep breath, bringing in the knowledge, bringing in an understanding of connection. And then breathing out to maintain that connection. And when you're ready, we can begin to slowly sort of come back to the space and the time that we're in. Allowing this experience, this memory, this episode, and this interaction to remain with us so that we are always drawn back to this place of knowledge and wisdom of the land, of the people, of all things that we see and things that we don't see. And when you're ready, if you've had your eyes closed, when you're ready, just gently open your eyes and allow this new energy to begin to flow and mix with the other energy. Thank you.
There's so much in the silence too, the spaces between. Thank you so much. And thank you for doing it in such a way that it's staying with us. It's staying with us all. I know it is with me. Well, Michael, Dr. YellowBird, you have so much to share with us. When you in your research, you have shared many things in writing and speaking that reflect the knowledge that Indigenous groups had. Without saying that, they had it. And as you do your research, you're finding many of those things. And that's what I really want to spend the time talking about, is your work in that. But if we could, just tell us about, as you took us into that, getting on the land. I'm curious to let the viewers know, what land are you from? And just a personal story, whatever you want to share about you growing up, and then we'll move into your work.
Okay. So I mean, like a lot of Indigenous people, we moved a lot throughout millennia. And so my first stories about the origin of the people, my father and many other elders talked about our sacred bundles. And our sacred bundles were like time capsules. And before they were actually taken and examined by, outside authorities and anthropologists and that kind of thing, it was really interesting. My father used to tell me stories about how different kinds of things in the bundles, certain bundles, not all bundles, but certain bundles kind of shared our a migration story. And so he used to always say that our people, probably sprang up somewhere in southern or central Mexico, and and probably in South America too, as well, he would say. And he talked about, the contents of the bundle, and the contents of the bundle had all these tropical bird feathers in there that would be from the rainforest. And then even mentioned one time that there was a monkey skull, what they would call a New World monkey skull, in the bundle. That would say, people had these encounters with these different creatures, these different times, and so this was a part of the origin, right? But even before that, the origin story says that our people, the Arikara people, I'm also Hidadza too on my mother's side, but the Arikara people also were people who came from the earth and existed in the earth at first, not as human beings or creatures. They existed as an emotion or a feeling or a resonation or an energy that had to develop into and evolve into a lower forms creatures, as they would say, and then began to continue to develop over a long period of time. It's just like an evolutionary biological kind of story, right? But it's true. This is what people talked about. They started with a feeling or an energy, a thought, that, and then as people developed and became more and more human-like, but weren't humans, but they were still moving towards the top of the earth. As they moved toward the top of the earth, they couldn't really get out, and so they had to, rely upon a number of creatures to help dig them out. So there was a long-nosed mouse, a badger, and a mole, and these are of course, this interaction that we had, dependency on other life forms and other creatures. So the long-nosed mouse was digging first, got tired, and then the mole was digging next. And the mole came out, and the first time the mole had ever been exposed to the sun blinded the mole. And that's why the mole is blind today, right? This is the story they tell. And then the badger had to break through. And as the badger broke through, and the sun hit the badger in the face. And so that's why you see the badger with, the black on its face and, where the sun hit it, and the white parts of the face. So the people then made their way out at that point, and they really were very naive, as kind of as the story goes. They weren't really fully developed, and they made, they were at the mercy of many different kinds of, things in the environment, of course, wild animals and dangers and those kinds of things. And so at that point, what they did is they began to call upon, a divine power. And it was Mother Corn they called upon. And Mother Corn took pity on the human beings and then gave them, direction and purpose. And so they started on a journey at that point, moving, going across these big bodies of water, swimming. And as they moved across the water, swimming, some of them couldn't make it because they had, some boats they were floating on, and some people were swimming. And some of the people actually drowned. And as they drowned, as the story goes, they turned into all the life in the sea, to all the fish and all the different kinds of life, which is why they say that, people are related to all the creatures in the sea at one time. They were very close. So they also moved into this big rainforest they were moving across, and some people got lost. And they became the creatures of the forest as well, And then as they moved to this big cliff, they were going up a cliff, all these hardships, right? This is kind of what Mother Corn was telling us. You're going to have all these hardships in life. Life is beautiful, but it's full of hardships, right? And so they're crawling up this cliff. Some of them couldn't make it, and as they fell, they turned into eagles, hummingbirds, bees, mosquitoes, all these different kinds of life in the air. So as they moved along, then they found these different places where they would settle, and they began to find wild corn and beans and all these things, and began to grow these things. Right? They began to domesticate them and grow them. And so as they moved further northward, they took them with them. And then, of course, they began to encounter other tribes. They began to give out with other tribes, corn and beans and squash and all these different kinds of things. And then we ended up in some ended up in Texas, some ended up in Louisiana. These are the Caddoan-speaking people. And they moved up northward in Oklahoma and Nebraska, South Dakota to North Dakota. And it's kind of where we actually settled then, and after a long, long period of time. So that's kind of the origin story along with the migration story. And so I always say that, I'm kind of a warm-blooded person, so I wish I would have stayed, in Texas or someplace, or stayed in Mexico instead of North Dakota, because it's much more, it's much warmer in other places.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is, it's kind of the story. But these are stories that were, the people told. But I guess the real teaching here was that life is full of hardships. It's difficult, and that was the kind of thing. And human beings have had to go through these different transitions, and never to forget, that the connection that we had with these things that was explained is that with water, we had a strong connection with water, with land, with earth, with the forests, all these different kinds of natural things in our lives that we are still strongly connected to. And of course, had a very intimate relationship with animals that had helped the human beings up. And so even today, if there's someone like a member of my tribe back home in 2024 that a badger may be in their yard or something, they'll talk about that, and they'll tell stories about how the badger helped the people, and they won't chase the badger away. They will just, let the badger be the badger, right? And kind of share a space with the badger, and so it's that kind of thing, I think. So I grew up then, because of that, I grew up in North Dakota in the U.S. On the three affiliated tribes, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara folks. And that was my growing up. And I guess I was born, I should say, I guess I was born, but I was born in 1954, at the time when our lands were being flooded out by the federal government and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And we were being moved from our villages, which we had inhabited for a few hundred years and had grown, all these different kinds of agricultural products. That's why I'm interested in some of the work that I do around Arikara ethnobotany and about Arikara corn and traditional agriculture, and how people had such a reverence for that. So in our latest book, we're talking about elders who had been interviewed by a guy by the name of Melvin Gilmore, who was a very, very famous ethnobotanist, passed away in the early 1920s or so. But he had interviewed a number of our tribal members back at that time about their relationship with wild plants and with domesticated corns and beans and squash and the Three Sisters and all these different kinds of things, sunflowers and tobacco that they grew, even grew watermelons. But watermelons are from Africa and they've made their way over, but spread very quickly across Turtle Island, to the point where when traders and explorers and government officials first ran into our people, they thought we had actually invented, or watermelons came from this part of the world. But they had, of course, they were hybriding the watermelons and growing them in different ways so that they were able to grow them, in a very short season, sometimes without lack of water. So there was a lot of, people say, well, indigenous people didn't have the scientific method, but clearly they did. They know from empirical sort of observations and experience that they were crossbreeding different species of corn and beans and squash and watermelons and all these different kinds of things. So they were doing that for a long period of time. Agriculture started over here in the Western Hemisphere about maybe 10,000 years ago, almost simultaneously at the same time it was starting, in Europe, and other in the Fertile Crescent Valley, So indigenous people have been engaged, in this really, really sort of deep relationship with the earth, these plants. But one of the things that, many of them did is that when they looked at, had this relation with plants, of course, they seen the plants not as just plants, but they were deities that were associated with the plants, right? And the sacredness of the plants. And of course, a lot of the spirituality and the religious sort of rituals and rites had to do with, people in their relationship with the land. And the food that they ate is very different than the way we see food now today. It's very different. So
Yeah.
So that's kind of, just a little bit, about me. I come from a family of 15, 11 boys and 4 girls. Uh, um, both my mother and father passed away. My father passed away at age 72 in 1997. My mother passed away during the pandemic at age 94 in 2022. But they left us a pretty deep legacy of who we were and our identity, our language, our culture, stories, introduction to our ancestors and relatives, many of them who were contemplatives in our tribe, and many who were spiritual leaders and healers and priests, as we say. We didn't have medicine men like a lot of tribes do. We had priests that would that were in some ways very, very much like some of the tribes and like the Aztec, for instance. They had a very, very kind of a strong role, very complex religion, and that kind of thing, like a lot of tribes did, in our area and up and down. So it's interesting to note that. So so that's kind of
That's
grew up on
great.
the reservation. Yeah. So yeah.
Well, thank you. There's so many things in what you just said, but one of them is I just want to thank you because in your origin story, it isn't romanticized. Yes, the big thing came through is the connection, but also that there is struggle. There is danger. And I think at this time, many people are looking for comfort. And I know that when I talk to some of my elders and go to the Amazon, they always ask, why do people up there, why do they value comfort so much? What do you get out of comfort? I mean, there's all this growth. So your story just reminded me of them, and for people to be aware, of connection. But now by what you've shared, it leads right into, so tell us about your research. Obviously it's connected, and how you just continued, that your mother and father, your ancestors must be really honored by you continuing the work in the way that you do. So could you tell us some few things about your research and what you found?
Yeah. So, and thanks for that. That's a good question. Well, I think, when I used to teach research at the graduate level when I was a professor at a couple of universities, and it's always about, the idea of the question, the research question, right? And sometimes I go back before that and say, before the question, there's context. And so for me, context has always been around the time that I grew up. I experienced a lot of racism, a lot of just trivializing of Indigenous culture, ignoring and censoring it. I grew up in at a time in the '60s, the late '50s and early '60s, at a time when that was a lot of Indigenous beliefs and practices and values and, uh, and culture was really treated as something that was primitive. It was childlike. It was devil worship, all this sort of stuff, and people had really no idea. And these were settlers that were coming in, had no idea, in church, Christians and government people coming in. So I, for years I pondered that as a young man, thinking like, why did our people do these things, right? But I was witness to some of these things because, I was still at the time when some of those ceremonies were still taking place. I didn't sit directly in there, but I taught and listened to people talk about it, and I, was able to observe little pieces of it. And then I started thinking, because the teachers, the white teachers, they always used to kind of ignore it or, treat it as something that was, not very important, and it never made our way into our education. On these Bureau of Indian Affairs schools, on the reservation, it really wasn't talked about much. It was more celebrating, the settler colonialism and all the settler leaders and the important people there, all these dead white people that we were studying, right? All the presidents and all that. And I started thinking about it as I started the university, like, and I always thought about it, like, what was in that people got, and I knew that, of course, that was spiritual, and I could see that people were healed and people did well. And so it took me a while then before I probably, it was even after I finished my PhD there, when I was I guess I was at Arizona State at the time. I really, or Kansas, one of the two I was at. I really started thinking about that, and that's the first time in the early '90s that the decade of the brain then came about. I think it was maybe it was George Bush declared the decade of the brain. So I started following that research then as when I was an assistant professor, and I was really interested. And I was reading a lot, really, just really, really scouring the literature that was coming out, because a lot was coming out at that time. Imaging was happening, and more studies were looking at things. It was just the very beginning. I had been a mindfulness practitioner since about 1975, and so I was very interested in the brain already because of when I was in school. I was a social work student. I was interested in mental health. What made you tick, and of course, most of the indigenous people were being treated as they had some kind of mental defects, or they had this inability to kind of maladaptive behavior to a modern sort of civilized society. And I thought, well, this is when you think about that as a young student, and you've got no one sort of countering that argument, then you start to kind of believe it yourself. Oh, what's wrong with our people, right? What's wrong with us, right? And so, but this curiosity kept me going, like thinking, okay, they had to be doing it for some reason. They had to do it, to survive all these millennia. These things had to make sense. And so, I think the first time after the decade of the brain had started, it was in the '90s. I was working with a group out of New Mexico, Family Alliance, and they had me coming in talking about my work in decolonization. And one time, the psychologist couldn't make it, so he asked me to do his presentation on the brain. I had, just very little knowledge about it, so I did. It didn't go over so well because I used his slides. I didn't know, when people asked me questions, I didn't know how to answer that. So at that point, then I decided, I'm going to take a deep dive into neuroscience. And as I dove deeper and deeper into neuroscience, then I began to find these connections about, how different parts of the brain activate, and stay activated when people are having different kinds of experiences. So every time I found an article or a set of articles or readings, I would take a look at that, and then I would sort of look at the parallels that were happening with indigenous people during ceremonial times, during times of stress, during times of starvation, during times of war, during times of love and healing and celebration. And I started finding these amazing, amazing kinds of parallels, and even up to doing these really important ceremonial dances. What was happening to the body. How the brain was getting bathed in these neurochemicals as they did these things that were very meaningful to them. And as you had a belief, in something, how it changed, the brain's shape and neuroplasticity, and how this belief that you maintained created, very, very distinct sort of patterns and cognitive reserve in the brain. And I thought, wow, this is so cool. And then then I started to look at older pictures of my people engaged in ceremony. And as I saw that, I could see all the different things that were happening then, because I had scoured the literature quite a bit. I'd read a lot of things and talked to different neuroscientists and said, am I on track thinking this way? People said, I hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so I would, send out messages and inquiries, and now it's kind of all over now, because it's, you've got you've got open access to all these articles, you've got people doing TED Talks talking about this stuff. And it's all sort of this affirmation of these kinds of things that the people knew back then that were improving their brain health, their molecular and cellular health, their bodies that were keeping them, and preparing them for these challenges, right? We know that, for instance, in my research, I was looking at some work by this neuroscientist called Joan Chiao, who is a neuroscientist. I think she's at Northwest University, University of Chicago. So she started talking about collectivist cultures, which indigenous people are. Back in the early 2010s, she was talking about that and doing a lot of sort of big global studies, and finding out that there was this particular gene called the serotonin transporter gene that was involved with collectivist behavior. And it's 5-HTTLPR was kind of, I think, the reference to. And what she was talking about, and what research talks about, is that that particular gene has an association with anxiety and depression. And so what the protective factor in is being in a collectivist community with people. You're planting together, you're celebrating together, you're praying together, you're doing ceremony together. And what happened with settler colonialism came into our villages and destroyed that collectivism. They broke up the communities. Any dances or any ceremonies that were sacred, contemplative, or even secular kinds of things were banned. By the federal government until 1978, with the end of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. But by then, a lot of those ceremonies had gone by the wayside. The religious leaders, the spiritual leaders had passed, and not a lot of that knowledge was left. But what I do is I like to go back and show, when I do presentations, especially in tribal communities, indigenous communities or organizations, I'll say these are the things our ancestors did. This was what was happening at the molecular level, for instance, happening at the level of enzymatic level, for instance, right? And how when we do those ceremonies, we can begin to undo the effects of colonization. We can actually begin to decolonize our bodies, at these different biological levels so that we can improve our health. We know that. We know that from Elizabeth Blackburn's work. She won the Nobel Prize in 2015, I believe, on her study of telomeres, that when people engage in certain kinds of behaviors, and telomeres at the end of the chromosomes are supposed to be longer. They are an indication of longevity and good health. But stress, racism, hate, fear, isolation, being marginalized, poverty, all these kinds of things, racially profiled, have an effect on our telomeres, and they shorten them. And what that means is that it exposes us to more, diseases of aging sooner than we should be. So these are the things that our ancestors were doing. They were dancing, they were singing, they were eating traditional foods, they were being in groups, supporting one another. So I tell people, it's very, very likely that they had very, very, robust telomeres at the end of their chromosomes, and that they were living very healthy lives, right? And that's just one example that I look at in many, many examples of what indigenous people did, right? And so Joan Chow's work has really been instrumental for me to kind of, just really, really sort of take a deep dive into this literature and say, wow, they did these things for a particular reason, and it sustained them. It gave them a sense of connection, to one another, to the land. And then there's much, much more, as you know, Anita. So.
Yes. Well, and we'll get back to, because we want to hear more. But this is part of what you just said. That's what just lit me up. My curiosity, you sparked it, because in hearing prophecies and hearing the stories, one of the prophecies that I've been hearing the last maybe 15 or 20 years, I know I heard it before, but it's playing. But it's not only from different tribes here in Turtle Mountain, but from, other parts of the world. They have their versions. And the way it goes is that, that the people are doing all these things that you just talked about. And then danger came. And as danger came, they would do and spirit would tell them, sing your songs, do your dance, be in ceremony, be in community. And then they'd go on, and then, the settlers came with this black book, and the people started dying, and trees would get, all sorts of animals and things would be in danger. And spirit said, sing your songs, do your dances, be in ceremony, and be in community. And that has just really stayed with me, because, all these things that are happening that are trying to tell us everything is separate, which we know is an illusion, and that we don't have power. We do have power, and the power of our ancestors that's within us. So I just want to thank you now with that, because that just made me go, oh, yeah, that's what we've been doing. And you've been studying it. And you just talked about how, singing our songs, the connection, all of this, everything, the foods we eat, everything is about it supports our well-being, but our well-being comes from our interconnection as well. We can't do anything alone. So you see me smiling is because you have really just sparked my curiosity even more with what you shared. And so with that, I know we only have about 10 minutes or so left, but I'd love to hear anything else that it comes to the fore of your mind and your heart to share with us, because this is for Indigenous people, but all people are going to be affected by that research about knowing what keeps us well, and to decolonize themselves, because
Yeah.
that's work of all of us. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, maybe some of the work that I've looked at, has been by guys like Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson, and they wrote a book called Altered Traits. That particular book, it's kind of really scoped the literature very, very deeply on contemplative practices. And it kind of leaves a really good path for us as human beings, I think. I don't know if they said that in the book. I don't recall reading that in the book, but they provide, evidence that all these studies have been, that have been done, that humans benefit from engaging in contemplative practices. They talk about 100 hours of practice. What does that bring you? Of course, emotional regulation improves, and your sense of connection and well-being improve. And it moves up, to 1,000 hours where things get even better. 5,000 hours where you actually begin to kind of see how the gray matter in your brain is spared, from the stresses of life. So it delays, aging in the brain and neurodegenerative diseases by, 8 years or more. And when you get out onto the land, and you get into like 10,000 hours, you have these very, really deep experiences, where, you can have these transcendent experiences of maybe a sense of timelessness and spacelessness and connection to, the ultimate reality, whatever that is, right? And that's what I would say to people is that, if you want to develop a relationship with the land, think about it in terms of the number of hours you spend on land, quality time, not just being out on the land and having picnics and stuff, or which is good. Don't get me wrong, but spending that alone time at the land, sitting on the land, being there for 100 hours. What will that do to your brain? What will that do to your telomeres? What does that do to your neurochemistry, to the dopamine in your body that gives you the reward, the serotonin that calms you down, or the oxytocin that flows when you begin to see the land as really being a relative to you, right? And that's probably not going to happen until maybe you start reaching 1,000 hours of being on the land. And that's sitting on the land. I'm talking about, an hour every day or 2 hours every day, depending upon people's, how they want to, the rate they want to get to that space, But I think that's the thing is that, it's talked about now in a lot of people talk about, like, we need to do a lot of land-based, education. And we need to spend more time on the land. Well, I can tell you that from this work that's been done in mindfulness neuroscience research, and when we contemplate on a place and we're in this place and the hours that build up, it begins to change the plasticity of the brain. Being out on the land a few times or whatever just doesn't do it, right? In order for people to really sort of develop that connection, you have to start thinking about it in terms of the amount of time you spent out there, that quality time you get your kids out there. That's for for those of us who are doing that now, but it's also for schools, for clinics, health providers, for the justice system, for teachers, parents, everybody. How can we get those kids out on the land and to sit on the land and begin to make a connection with the land? We've got this, chance. We don't have a lot, of space right now and room for error because of climate change and how quickly things are changing. But I think within a generation, if we pursued something like this, and if we got people close to the land and contemplating and being with the land, I think we could generate, within one generation, maybe a complete reversal. I think it's possible because that's how quickly the brain can change with that many hours of practice. So we know it already from with the Western science that is published. So let's take that and we can move it in that direction. So
that sounds hopeful. And I'm, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about my two sons who are now grown. They're in their 20s and 30s. And we always had them out in the land, and they grew up on this mountain that we live on. And as they got older and to other kids in different ways, and like, no, I want to go play, with my machines and all those kinds of things. And we still do that. And, you lose a little hope. And then they go off and live somewhere else. And what are they doing? Oh, almost daily, at least a couple of times a week, they're going on lawn hikes. They're sitting in places. They're finding out about where they are. And I smile because everyone can do this, right? Everyone can, because we already are connected, but we don't, it's like the breathing you did with us at the very beginning, the reciprocity. We're always receiving, and we're should be always giving, but sometimes we're not doing it in a sacred way. So we chop the trees and pollute the water and all the kinds of things. So I love that vision that in the next generation, and it's not too late for any of us to, there's all sorts of things you can do. As you said, just create the time and be on the land. And it's wonderful. So thank you. Yeah, go ahead. And we still have a few more minutes if you want to share something else.
Well, I was going to say, a lot of us in our generation, we spent more time on the land, especially us res kids. We were out on the land all the time, every day, all the time until it was time to come home. When it was 10 o'clock at night, right? We were outside, all kinds of weather. So we put in a lot of hours, sitting in places, being in places. And I recall many, many different times where, our parents or grandparents would talk about particular groves of trees or particular valleys, particular waters. They would say, this is what happened there. These are these sacred sites for us, So as young boys, and we had, all of our girl cousins and all of our friends, we would go. Sometimes we'd be in these spaces. We'd sit there on the sides of hills and just talk and be quiet, contemplate. No cell phones. There were no airplanes flying over. There was just nothing. This was just kind of way back then when that was possible to have that really close connection with the land. You could smell the wild turnips, the wild onions, the grass, the plants. We'd always have a number of res dogs hanging out with us that would follow us, down to the rivers, places. And we our bodies experience that. They experience walking over the land, ducking under bushes, stepping over waters, going through waters and coming out with all covered with leeches, and then we'd all scream and pull them off and laugh and that kind of thing. And then we'd eat the berries of the trees. And, we dig up, like I said, wild turnips and wild onions. And we'd go to these particular springs that were, clean springs we could drink at, that were, sometimes we're told that you have to be there at a certain time, drink a certain way. There's always, and we were told this, I remember there are spirits that inhabit certain places that watch over it. So take care of those places. Don't, do those kinds of things that, we shouldn't do. Like we should, different times of the year, we shouldn't pick the berries, or certain times of the year, or you shouldn't, do this or that kind of thing. But you should always have respect because, our people believed there were guardian spirits over the waters, over certain, trees where berries grew, or certain plants and areas that, sometimes weren't for human beings. That those were the homes and the territory of the spirits that you kind of acknowledge that, or certain animals use this space. My dad used to say that, this is a place where, deer are giving birth to, their babies. Don't disturb that place, right? We don't do that. He said, we don't do those kinds of things, This is kind of the circle of life. So, and I think that's how we were kind of, calibrated in our brains and in our bodies to have that connection. So it was really, I think it's really important in that way, because when you have that kind of episodic, experience, you have an episodic memory of that. And that's what, parents should always give kids. It's like, wow, the sensation of that place, whether it was hot or it was cold or it was windy or whatever it is, and you spend time in there, that will always come back to you as an episodic memory. It's like, wow, yeah, because, the way memory works is that you sit around and you begin to encode, things like the sight, the sound, the taste, the touch, and smell of a place. And then you consolidate that and, all that into a memory, right? And that becomes a memory. And then you put it in storage. But every time someone says, yeah, remember that time, how windy it was? And boom, your body, retrieves that memory and say, yeah, we're going to have to go out and do that again, man. It was, but the more and more you do it, the more and more, wind becomes life. Wind becomes spirit. Wind becomes a storyteller. Wind becomes power, right? Wind becomes healer, right? Wind becomes destroyer. And it's not just like the wind, it has its story, because that's the episodic memory of that. And then as you go back, you increase and encode that even stronger. So then as tribal people, we have a whole story about wind, right? What wind is and who wind is. Wind and her daughters, and her beautiful daughters. and the power, that exists there, right? So that's the thing I'm talking about, is that when children are given that experience, they begin to encode, consolidate, store, and then they can retrieve that. So,
oh, I really celebrate you, because just hearing you talk, how can I say this to make sense? When I'm with various elders and circles and that, and they haven't met me before, they'll say, "There's something else about you." And I'll say, "Yeah, I have a PhD," because I don't always, we're not doing Zoom and they see it on there. And they go, "Oh, too bad." And I know what they mean. They don't mean, "Oh, it's the," and then they usually say, "Oh, we understand, you're bridging or something." But that's just it, is that when you go through the training, it's both learning it, but also keeping what you know to be true, the spirit, because science doesn't take that in. Although science finally is starting to say, well, we really don't know everything, and some of the things that you say exist, we're kind of finding out a little bit about them, and we may never know. Hello,
yeah.
yet our people did, and they did know that, and so bringing in spirit, and also at the same time being a scientist. There's nothing. I mean, our indigenous people are the first scientists all over the world, so it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, well, that's right, and I think that's the issue with indigenous people. A lot of times they draw a binary there, and they don't because a lot of them have not had that exposure to understand that we have been scientists. I mean, gosh, you can go all across the Western Hemisphere, and you can find pyramids, you know, in the Mayan pyramids, right? You look at that. How did you do that? Well, it's going to take some very sophisticated engineering and math, and to develop a pyramid and to build a pyramid in that particular kind of way. Well, what about all the 3,000 different varieties that the Incan potato, the potatoes that Incans, created 3,000 different varieties that grow at all these different, altitude levels, right? All these different kinds of ways. What about, the brain surgery that was done by Incas, a few thousand years ago? I forget what they call it, but it's when they drill into the brain. I was reading that research bed. It says that, when they had a head injury, or and their brain was swelling, and they drilled into the brain, they found, pathologists have found, skulls that were healed, and the people lived and they healed, and they were much more successful at that kind of surgery than people were in the Civil War when they were doing that same kind of surgery. I mean, they outperformed them that many thousands of years earlier. So, who came up with the concept of zero? Crescent Valley people, and then Chinese, and then of course, in Mexico, the Mayans, these are Cahokia and St. Louis was a sort of what I call the indigenous Silk Road, where you had this, community that was built just outside of St. Louis, where tribes were coming from all over the place to trade, to barter, to bargain, to kind of intermingle, to meet each other, to share whatever it was. So that kind of exchange was going on for a long, long time here. These mounds, these big, beautiful mounds you see around the Great Lakes, that a lot of them are gone now because settlers just plowed them under. But when you can see them, down south too, in Mesoamerica and South America, where you can see these panthers from the sky. You can see these, thunderbirds from the sky. You can see these monkeys, from the sky that these people built, and, out of mounds that you can't see on the ground, but they had to engineer these things in a particular kind of way to use certain kinds of reckoning, engineering, surveying, mathematical, science to do this. And so what happened with settler colonialism is that was the main thing about settler colonialism, was to not only replace the indigenous person, but it's to eliminate the indigenous person, eliminate their governance, their knowledge of the governance that they had, their relationship with the land, their science, their arts, their spirituality, and they did a great job. When we again look down at the Mayan codices, in Mexico, when the conquistadors arrived, they destroyed almost all of those that had this tremendous knowledge on them, and only 3 exist in the world. But when you look at those and people talk about this, you can only sort of, kind of think about, how much knowledge must have been in there. And I was reading one text where one Catholic priest was writing about how when the conquistadors were destroying these other codices, how these indigenous academics and scholars were just so distressed. They were just crying because it was like burning the libraries, all this knowledge that was carved on these stones, all this knowledge that was there. And of course, it was just destroyed, And so we talk about, barbarians and primitive thinking and that kind of thing. And that's how indigenous, people were treated. So that gets me kind of all the way back to like why I do the research that I do, because I know that the lifestyle that people live, the way that they thought, the way they believed, the way they engaged the world, have not only left markers, on the walls of caves where they drew, these their different figures, or they carved on rocks or whatever, but they also left marks in the body that are still with us today, in our genetics and in our different parts of our body. So this is the evidence we still have that we need to kind of share with the young people, to share with scholars, to share with elders and those kinds of folks, because we have had such a rich and dynamic and just transformative experience as indigenous people that a lot of people just never pay attention to. It's always Western science, and like as you said, Anita, we were scientists long before people were scientists in Europe.
Definitely.
Other places.
Definitely. Yeah. So hopefully, I'm sure it has, because it made me so curious. Those of you that are watching, that we hope you become more curious and learn more. You'll see on the site the books that Michael YellowBird has written, and all the things that he said. You can find out more. It's not too late, but we have to get busy with it, because the sacred sites, as you were talking about, some that still remain are, we're trying to preserve them, because they want to be destroyed, and many things. So it's just really the call. The call is not only from Michael and me, but it is from Earth herself, all the things we're part of. And so I know that those people who listen to the Be Here Now Network and to this show are definitely wanting to be well, to be able to have a positive impact on the world. And so, Michael, I thank you so much for being here. And I want to just give you, if there's a last word or something you want to leave with the group, either a dream or just whatever you want to say to close.
Well, I think something you mentioned earlier is really important, and that's prophecy. I think that, young people today are really interested in indigenous prophecy, and are examining and exploring that. I think about prophecy in the way that some of these folks, like one of my grandfathers, his name was Bear's Teeth, and had another grandfather named Kakanaksana, which means crow ghost. Some of the prophecies they had, these are Rikara, prophets. And it was really interesting when I think about that, because these are the people, that I think had spent that time that I talked about earlier, in this deep contemplative state for, years and years, right? And that they had achieved this particular kind of sense of transcendence that we see in the literature, where their parietal brain goes offline, and the parietal brain kind of is the part of our brain that sort of codes for, seeing things in 3 dimensions, but it also is part of our visual spatial reasoning. So that in some of those, once that part of the brain goes offline, then people have this sense of, timelessness, spacelessness, this sense of connectedness to all things. And this is something that I was reading that Andrew Newberg was writing. He's a neuroscientist in the US. And it made perfect sense, because I thought this is what people were doing at that time, right? And then they were sort of bringing back to the people, like, this prophecy, in their own observations of the world. They were drawing these connections to what was happening in the world, going to this place of transcendence, and drawing upon other sources of knowledge that, we can only speculate, what those are at this point. But the influence, when the brain gets into this place, of this, when it's really, really in this transcendent place, we know from some of the research that the brain goes into this state where a gamma wave happens, and the brain gets into this place of maximal sensitivity, right? When it's tasting, touching, feeling, sensing things that we can't when we're not in that space, And then, and some neuroscientists, not a lot, but some have talked about, then we start to have these paranormal experiences where we're in connection with other things that we don't normally connect with, right? And that's where some of that prophecy comes from that kind of learning and that kind of understanding. So, and most of those prophecies kind of move in that same direction, no matter what culture it is. Those learned people from all cultures kind of have, kind of found that sweet spot where, they can, tap into that, whatever that knowledge is, right? So,
Yeah.
maybe
Well,
that's
thank you.
what I think about. So,
Yeah, no, yes. So everyone tap into not only the seen, but the unseen, and prophecy is one way to do that. So I'm hoping some of you will look up more about that as well. So I just want to thank you, Dr. Michael YellowBird. Michael, I am so glad to know you. I hope to keep a long time friendship and relationship with you, and wish you the best in all your research. And of course, I just want to say, I know you already do it, but sing your songs, do your dance, be in ceremony, and be in community. I wish you well.
thank you so much, Anita.
Thank you.